In the final days of September 1878, while other homesteaders along the Missouri Breaks were stacking firewood and caulking log walls for the coming winter, Michelle did the unthinkable. She soaked wool blankets in freezing creek water, then pressed them onto her cabin walls until they froze solid. Neighbors called it the ice house and laughed, but she had learned a secret from the trappers. That ice could shield against the wind. What they didn't know was that it would trap more than heat. Subscribe to witness the chilling truth. She was 29 years old, a widow on 160 acres of raw Montana territory, with nothing between her and a Dakota winter but thin log walls that let the wind sing through the chinking. Most women would have returned east. Michelle stayed. In a chance encounter earlier that fall, an aging trapper named James Coulter had told her of a strange practice used by mountain men in the high country. Wet wool, frozen against timber, made a shell that could bend the fiercest gusts. The homesteaders around the breaks thought she'd lost her mind, but Michelle had no other options. The central question hung over her claim like the gray winter sky. Could a wall of ice actually keep a person alive? The answer would arrive sooner than anyone expected, carried by a man who had spent more winters on the frontier than any of them combined. And he wasn't coming to praise her idea. His name was Reuben Thorne, and he had spent more winters on the northern plains than any man still drawing breath in the Missouri Breaks. He rode a heavy freight wagon pulled by two dull-eyed mules that had pulled through blizzards even he preferred not to remember. When he stopped that November afternoon and saw Michelle's cabin wrapped in sheets of frozen wool, he didn't laugh. He simply stared, his gray bearded jaw working as if chewing through a difficult thought. The blankets hung like thick, ragged plates, their surfaces glittering in the pale sunlight, fused solid to the log walls. Steam still rose faintly from the newest layer she had pressed against the south corner, where the wind bit hardest. Reuben climbed down slowly and walked close enough to rap his knuckles against a frozen fold. The sound was dull, like knocking on clay. "You're trying to stop winter with laundry," he said. It wasn't a question. Michelle kept her hands inside her shawl, watching him from the porch. Beside her, the caramel-colored dog stirred but did not growl. She had learned weeks ago that silence answered certain men better than words. Reuben turned and gestured toward the vast open prairie beyond her claim, where the northern ridge already carried a thin cap of early snow. "That wind comes down from the territories carrying ice like buckshot. It'll peel this crust off your walls before midnight," she finally spoke. "I've seen it hold." "You've seen it hold through a mild October blow," he corrected. "Not a Dakota winter." He stepped back and looked beyond the frozen blankets toward the woodpile, which was barely waist high. Then toward the chimney, which lacked the heavy stonework most homesteaders built as a windbreak. "You're gambling on an idea, and when the storm finds the gap between that idea and reality, this cabin becomes a stone-cold coffin." Reuben climbed back onto his wagon, the old leather of his gloves cracking as he took up the reins. His last words hung in the air like frost. "God doesn't hand out mercy to gamblers on the frontier." The wagon creaked away and Michelle stood alone on the frozen dirt, the dog pressing its nose against her leg. She had heard the same warning from half a dozen settlers already, each version differently phrased but exactly the same in meaning. Foolishness. A woman's ignorance. A ghost of a dead husband's abandoned notions. They didn't understand, and she had stopped trying to explain. The idea had arrived 3 months earlier in the last week of August, when James Coulter rode through the breaks on his way south. He was an aging trapper, nearly 70 winters old, his face a ruin of frostbite scars and squint lines. People said he had spent so long in the high country that he had forgotten how to live among men. He stopped at her claim only because his mule had thrown a shoe near the creek. While Michelle fetched water and a strip of rawhide, he had stood staring at the cabin's thin log walls, studying every crack and chink as if reading a map. "You'll freeze here," he said plainly. "Not because your walls are thin, because this place sits in the throat of a wind funnel, that north slope over there. It'll guide every gust straight into your front door." He then told her something that sounded like madness. Years ago, in the Wind River Range, He had watched a small party of French-Canadian trappers survive a winter storm that killed everyone else in the basin. Their secret was simple. They soaked their heavy wool blankets in water, pressed them against the outside of their lean-to, and let the cold freeze them solid. The ice didn't warm the shelter, but it changed the way the wind moved across it. The frozen wool became a seamless skin, hard as rock, that deflected the brunt of the storm and trapped a pocket of still air between the ice and the canvas. The wind raged, but the cold stopped leaking in through every seam. Michelle had listened, and when Coulter rode away, she did not forget. She began preparing on the first morning of October. The process was brutal. She hauled creek water in 2 heavy wooden pails, walking the frozen path so often that the rope handles cut grooves into her palms. Each blanket, old Army issue wool, stiff and full ed, had to be soaked until it was saturated but not dripping. Then she lifted the sodden mass against the log wall, smoothing it flat with her bare hands while the cold water turned her fingers numb and then number still. The wool froze quickly once the temperature dropped below freezing, sometimes within 10 minutes, sometimes less if the wind was up. She layered them methodically, overlapping like shingles on a roof, working from the base of the wall upward until the entire cabin, top to bottom, was encased in a patchwork shell of ice and wool. By the second week of November, the cabin looked as if a glacier had crawled over it and stopped. Neighbors who came to gawk called it the ice house. They joked that she'd wake up one morning frozen to her bed. A few of them, the ones with long memories, remembered a story from the Hudson's Bay Company journals of a trader who tried something similar on the Saskatchewan River and did wake up frozen. One afternoon, a woman named Esther Lyle rode over from the next claim east. Esther was 10 years older than Michelle, a practical woman who had buried 2 children and a husband to the frontier. She looked at the frozen blankets without a trace of humor. "I've seen men double layer their logs and still lose toes," she said. "This is a woman's work trying to do a man's job." "It's not about the cold," Michelle replied. She crouched beside the cabin and tapped a knuckle against the ice shell. The sound was solid, dense, not the hollow ring of a frosted coat, but the dull thud of something with real substance. "It's about the wind. The ice stops the wind from pushing through every crack. Without the wind, the cold stays outside long enough for the fire to matter." Esther was not convinced. She tugged her wool scarf tighter and shook her head slowly. "Wind is smarter than ice. It'll find a way." After Esther left, Michelle walked around the cabin, checking every seam. She had made mistakes. She discovered them during an early cold snap in late October, when a sudden shift in wind direction had caught the western corner and peeled 2 blankets away from the logs. The ice had cracked like old porcelain, and the wool beneath had been torn loose. She'd spent that entire night outside in the dark, rewetting replacement blankets in a half-frozen bucket, pressing them into place while the wind drove sleet into her eyes. She learned that the overlap had to be exact, the edges sealed against the grain of the gusts, not just any direction. She learned that the thickest ice formed when the water was just above freezing, not ice cold, and that letting the wool freeze too fast created brittleness. She adjusted. She refroze the weak points. She built a second layer on the north wall, then a third, until the ice there was over 2 inches thick. And then she gave up trying to explain any of it to anyone. Late in the second week of November, James Coulter himself returned. He rode in quietly, the same mule now reshod, and he stopped at the edge of the property without speaking. He studied the ice-covered cabin, the glisten of frozen wool catching the low afternoon sun, the way the snow scattered in strange patterns around the foundation instead of piling against the walls. For a long time he didn't move. Michelle stood in the doorway and watched the old trapper circle the cabin like a wild animal studying a foreign object. He ran a scarred hand over the ice, tapped it, then knelt near the base where a low drift had begun forming a few yards out from the wall. When he finally stood, his expression was unreadable. Then he spoke not to her but to the air itself. "Wind don't sound right around this place anymore." He didn't elaborate. He climbed back onto his mule and rode slowly toward the north ridge, disappearing into the gray-brown line where the prairie met the sky. But his words stayed with her. They were not praise. They were not condemnation, they were simply observation. She had changed something about the storm's behavior, and a man who had survived 69 winters had noticed. By the end of November, the temperature had fallen so far that water left in a bucket formed a sheet of ice across the top within an hour of sunrise. The prairie grass was brittle, snapping like twigs underfoot. The sky took on the pale iron hue that old-timers called the color of held breath. The wind, which had blown almost continuously for weeks, suddenly stopped. Completely. Michelle knew what that meant. Coulter had warned her. The silence was not peace. It was the plains gathering violence. She moved through the cabin with a calm, almost mechanical urgency. She hauled extra water not for the blankets now, but for drinking and cooking. She moved her small supply of split wood inside the porch, protected beneath the ice overhang. She checked the dog's chain, gave him extra scraps, and prayed. And then she stood on the porch, one hand resting against the frozen wool, and looked toward the northern ridge. 2 days before the blizzard arrived, Reuben Thorne rode past one final time. He had heard the weather reports from the fort. He knew what was coming. He didn't bother to climb down this time. He simply reined in his mules, looked at the ice-wrapped cabin, and shook his head. "I'll say a prayer for you," he said, and his voice held no malice, only the weary certainty of a man who had seen too many bad ideas end in frozen graves. "But you'll need more than prayers when that sky splits open." The mules pulled on, and the wagon vanished into the gray light. Michelle went inside, closed the door, and barred it. That night the wind returned. Not a gust, not a breeze, but a single, terrible roar that sounded as if the entire northern plains were exhaling at once. The cabin shuddered, the dog whined, and somewhere outside the ice began to sing, a low, groaning note that built and built until the darkness itself seemed to vibrate. Michelle opened the door just a crack and looked out. The blizzard had not yet arrived, but it was on the final mile, and the only thing standing between her and a burial in white was a shell of frozen laundry that the entire territory believed would kill her. The blizzard struck at 2 hours before dawn, not with a gentle brush but with a wall of ice and wind that hit the cabin like a battering ram. The whole structure groaned as if the logs themselves were about to pull apart. Outside, the world vanished into a spinning void of white needles that hissed against the frozen blankets with the sound of 1,000 cracked whips. The dog whimpered and crawled under the table. Michelle sat against the far wall with her shawl pulled tight, a single candle throwing unsteady light across the room while the storm tried to claw its way inside. For the first hour, she was certain the ice shell would fail. Every gust that rammed the north wall sent a low, shuddering vibration through the floor. She could feel the pressure shift, the way the cabin momentarily tightened like a held breath before exhaling again. Her mind ran through every junction, every overlapping seam, every weak spot she had repaired in the dark after the October failure. If even one edge had lifted, the wind would find it, pry it open, and peel the whole frozen skin away in minutes. But the cabin held. The vibration never became a crack. The groan never became a splintering shriek. Instead, a strange rhythm began to emerge from the chaos outside. The wind would roar across the ridge, slam into the ice shell, and then, just for a heartbeat, the sound would change. It would rise, as if the storm had stumbled upward and lost its footing. The heavy, hammering impact she remembered from childhood winters on the plains was not there. The blows were being deflected, lifted over the roof, forced to carry their load of snow somewhere beyond the cabin instead of against it. She crept to the north window, which was no more than a small square of oiled paper set in the logs. The paper bulged inward with each gust, but it did not tear. She pressed her ear to the cold wood and listened. Beyond the immediate hiss of snow against the wall, she could hear a deeper sound, a long, rushing exhale traveling above the roof line. The wind was not dying. It was climbing. The thought that formed in her mind was not relief. It was the same quiet, almost detached observation that James Coulter had made weeks earlier. The wind doesn't sound right around this place anymore. By midday, the blizzard had not slackened. The sky outside remained a solid wall of shifting gray into gray, so dense that even the nearest fence post disappeared into white obscurity. Inside the cabin, the temperature had fallen, but not catastrophically. The small iron stove radiated enough heat to keep the room survivable, and the firewood stack, which she had feared would be consumed within hours, was shrinking far more slowly than she had calculated. The heat stayed in the room longer between feedings. The cold crept in only through the inevitable cracks, not through every chink as it had in previous winters. The ice shell was acting as a windbreak, and without the wind pulling warmth out of every seam, the cabin's thin walls were holding the fire's gift. She fed the stove, checked the dog's water, and then wrapped her shawl tighter and sat with her back to the warmest log while the storm raged on. For the first time since Reuben Thorne's final warning, she allowed herself to believe that the frozen blankets might actually work. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but enough. Then, near dusk, a new sound cut through the storm's steady roar, a sharp, brittle crack like the snapping of thick ice underfoot. Her stomach dropped. Somewhere on the western corner, where the wind had shifted slightly in the afternoon, something had given way. She stood and pulled on her coat, her hands moving before her mind could talk her out of it. The dog rose and pressed itself against her leg, its fur bristling. She opened the door a crack, and the storm shoved its way in, blasting snow across the floor. The wind hit her face like a handful of sand. She pulled a coil of rope from the hook by the door and tied one end around her waist, the other around the heavy porch beam. She had seen mountain men do this in stories. A lifeline in case the white took your sense of direction 2 steps from the door. Then she stepped outside. The cold was immediate and violent. The air burned inside her nose. Snow drove sideways so thickly that she could not see the woodpile 6 feet away. She moved along the wall, one hand pressed against the frozen blanket surface, feeling her way toward the western corner. The ice was slick and solid under her fingers, but near the corner she found the damage. A section of blanket had cracked away from the logs, a flap of ice and wool lifting and slamming in the wind like a broken shutter. Water had seeped behind it during a brief afternoon warming she had not noticed, and the refrozen edge had been torn loose by a gust from an unexpected angle. She wrestled the flap back against the wall, the wind fighting her for control. The cold metal of the water bucket sat frozen to the porch step, but she had wrapped it earlier in straw. She broke the ice crust with a hammer blow, soaked a rag, and pressed it against the lifted seam. Then she held it there, her wet fingers going numb in seconds, while the new water froze and bonded the wool back to the wood. The process took less than 10 minutes, but by the time she stumbled back through the door and pushed it shut, her hands were pale and stiff, and the dog was whining piteously. She sat by the stove, rubbing life back into her fingers, and she understood with perfect clarity that the ice shell was not a passive defense. It was a living thing that had to be maintained, adjusted, read. The storm was a mindless force, but it was clever in its persistence. It would probe every seam, test every angle, and if she relaxed for even 1 hour, it would find the weakness and break through. For the next 2 days, the blizzard did not pause. It came in waves, each one slightly different in sound and direction than the last. The cabin interior became a tiny island of firelight and stillness surrounded by a roaring white ocean. Time lost its shape. She slept in fragments, waking to feed the stove, to press her ear against the wall, to listen for the telltale crack of another seam giving way. None came. The repair held. The ice shell, battered and sardonically fragile-looking, continued to turn the worst of the storm's fury upward and over. Late on the second night, she noticed a change in the way the log walls felt. She placed her palm flat against the inside surface, where normally the cold would seep through and chill her immediately. The wood was cool, but not frigid. It did not radiate the dead, pulling cold that could steal heat from a room faster than a stove could replace it. The ice blanket outside had created a pocket of still air between itself and the logs, and that air was acting as insulation. The same principle that kept a double-layered buffalo robe warm was now operating on the scale of an entire cabin wall. The wind had been tricked into building a buffer zone. In the deepest hour of darkness on the third night, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind lost its sustained howl and broke into uneven gusts. The snow stopped hissing against the walls and fell more softly, the flakes no longer propelled like shot. She opened the door just enough to peer out, and the blackness was absolute. But the air felt different, thinner, less aggressive. The blizzard was blowing itself out somewhere over the eastern prairies. When morning came, it arrived with a pale, milk-colored light that seemed almost painful after so many days of gray void. She pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch, and the stillness was so complete that her own breathing sounded loud in her ears. The dog bounded out ahead of her, plunging into the snow, and then stopped, confused, because the world had been rearranged. The ice shell still clung to the cabin walls, but now it was buried behind a new formation. Beyond the perimeter of the house, the snow had piled into a massive curved drift that rose almost to the edge of the roof on the north and west sides. It looked as if the storm had built a fortress around the cabin, a white rampart packed hard and dense by the very wind that had tried to destroy her. The drift wall followed the contours of the ice blankets, not pressing against them but standing a few feet back, leaving a narrow, sheltered trough of still air between the snow and the logs. In the trough, the ground was barely covered with a thin dusting of powder. The woodpile, the path to the privy, the dog's chain, all were visible and accessible under a shallow blanket of white. Beyond the drift wall, the prairie was a wasteland of sculpted snow, hard-crusted and wind-drippled, stretching toward a horizon that had been scrubbed clean of color. But inside the small pocket she had created, the wind's violence had been neutralized. The storm, in its mindless fury, had deposited its load exactly where she needed it, building an insulating barrier instead of a burial mound. She stood for a long time just staring. The ice shell was still there, still frozen solid, its surface now buried under the new snow. The system had not merely survived. It had worked better than she had imagined. The storm had been redirected, forced to exhaust itself on the outer edges of her design, and in doing so it had become part of the defense. It was mid-morning when Reuben Thorne rode into view. His mules were lathered from pushing through deep snow, and the wagon was abandoned somewhere behind him on the trail that no longer existed. He came on horseback, his greatcoat crusted with frost, his gray beard frozen into a stiff mask around his mouth. He had ridden out expecting to find a buried cabin, a blocked chimney, perhaps the body of a foolish widow frozen somewhere beneath the drift. He had seen the same ending a dozen times before, and he was already rehearsing the grim duty of digging out the dead. But as he crested the last rise and looked down at Michelle's claim, he pulled the reins so sharply that the horse stumbled and snorted. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney, straight as a flagpole into the still morning air. Not sideways, not flattened by wind, straight up. He rode closer, dismounting at the edge of the drift wall, and then he saw the cabin. It was not buried. It stood in a strange, sheltered basin, surrounded by walls of snow but clear at its center. The dog was running circles in the shallow powder. Michelle was outside, calmly brushing snow from the woodpile. She looked up as he approached, and she saw something she had never seen on Reuben Thorne's face before. Not anger, not pity, not disdain. Something closer to bewilderment. He walked through the deep outer snow until he crossed the boundary of the drift wall, and then he stopped. The wind, which had been gusting fitfully across the open prairie, died. It simply ceased. The air in the sheltered basin was perfectly still, and the silence was so complete that he could hear the faint crackle of the fire inside the cabin, the creak of a loose shutter, the dog's feet crunching in the snow. He removed his hat and stared at the towering drift, the frozen blankets beneath, the clear breathing space around the logs. "You didn't stop the storm," he said at last. His voice was hoarse from the cold, and it carried a note of something like reverence. He gestured toward the drift wall. "You taught it where to break." Michelle rested her hands on the broom handle. She did not answer with triumph or sarcasm. She simply nodded, because standing there in the quiet that the storm itself had built around her, no explanation was needed. Reuben Thorne, the man who had warned her of a frozen grave, now stood inside the proof that the grave had become a sanctuary. Word traveled slowly through the Missouri breaks that winter, but it traveled. Within a week, other homesteaders began appearing, not to mock but to measure. They rode through the deep snow with lengths of rope and scraps of paper, asking how far apart the blankets should overlap, what temperature of water froze strongest, how to angle the seams against the wind. Michelle told them what she could, walking them through the principles that James Coulter had planted in her mind months earlier. The idea that had nearly gotten her family killed became the one thing that might keep theirs alive. But the man whose single conversation had started all of this was still out there. James Coulter had not been seen since his whispered observation in November, and as the winter deepened, Michelle found herself wondering what he would make of the ice fortress that had grown from his long-ago seed. She would not have to wonder for long. Coulter was riding back, and this time he was not coming alone. James Coulter rode in on the last morning of January, and beside him on a raw-boned roan mare sat a woman none of the Brake settlers had ever seen before. She was old, older even than Coulter, her face a map of deep lines and her eyes the pale gray of river ice. She wore a capote of Hudson's Bay wool, its stripes faded almost to nothing, and she carried herself with the quiet, unapologetic authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. Her name was Ann Wahpeton, and she had been born 68 years earlier in a Métis winter camp on the Saskatchewan River. She was Coulter's former trapping partner from his years in the Northern Territories, and she was the person who had taught him the secret of frozen blankets 3 decades before he ever spoke a word of it to Michelle. They dismounted in the sheltered basin, and Ann walked slowly around the ice-shelled cabin while Coulter stood back with his arms crossed inside his coat. She did not tap the ice or run her hands across it. She simply looked, her pale eyes tracing every seam and overlap as if she were reading a language she had not seen written in many years. Michelle stood on the porch, the dog motionless beside her, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then Ann turned to Coulter. "She did the north wall right," she said. Her voice was low and graveled with age. "Better than you ever did," Coulter grunted. "I taught her the principle." "You taught her half the principle," Ann corrected. She crouched with surprising ease and pointed toward the base of the wall where the ice blanket met the frozen ground. "You told her to soak the wool and let it freeze. You didn't tell her about the berm." Michelle stepped down from the porch. "What berm?" Ann straightened. Her expression was not unkind, but it carried the weight of knowledge that had come from trial and fatal error. "The mound of packed snow and straw that you build against the bottom edge before the first freeze. It seals the gap where cold air creeps under the wall. Without it, your floor stays cold no matter how warm the fire. With it, you trap a dead air cushion that holds the heat down low where you sleep." Michelle felt the truth of the words immediately. The cabin had stayed survivable during the blizzard, but the floor had been cold. She had spent every night with her feet wrapped in an extra blanket, and the dog had refused to lie anywhere but on the hearthstones. The ice shell had protected the walls, but the ground had been bleeding heat into the frozen earth beneath the foundation. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked Coulter. The old trapper removed his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. "I didn't know about the berm myself until Ann taught me. I didn't think you'd need it. I thought the ice alone would be enough." And gave a short, humorless laugh. "You thought wrong, but so did every man who ever froze to death in a shelter he thought was finished." The 4 of them went inside, and Ann spent the next hour describing techniques that Michelle had never imagined. She explained how to mix wood ash into the water before freezing the blankets, because the ash darkened the ice and absorbed faint winter sunlight, adding a tiny increment of passive warmth. She described how to angle the blanket layers not only against the prevailing wind, but to account for the back eddies that formed when the wind wrapped around the corners of the cabin. She spoke of the second freeze, the critical moment in late winter when the ice began to soften during the day and refreeze at night, and how that cycle could create hidden cracks that would fail in the next storm. "The ice is never finished," Ann said. "It is always becoming something else. Your job is to know what it is becoming before it becomes it." Michelle listened and did not interrupt. For weeks she had believed she had mastered the technique. Now she understood she had merely survived its first test. The real knowledge was deeper and more demanding, and it was being handed to her by a woman whose face carried the marks of winters far worse than anything the Missouri breaks could conjure. But Ann had not ridden all the way from the Saskatchewan country merely to share refinement of a freezing technique. She had come with a warning, and she delivered it that same afternoon while the three of them stood beside the towering drift wall that the blizzard had built around the cabin. "The ice works in the deep cold," she said. "It works better than log walls or snow fences. That is the problem." Michelle frowned. "How is it a problem?" "Because word of this will travel," Anne replied. Her pale eyes moved across the sheltered basin as if she could already see the future taking shape. "Homesteaders will want to learn it. The army will want to document it for the frontier forts. Traders will want to sell blankets treated with some expensive nonsense that they claim freezes better. And all of them will forget the one thing that makes it work." Coulter looked at the ground. He already knew what she was going to say. "The ice works because it is maintained every day," Anne said. "It is not a wall you build once and forget. It is a living relationship between the cold and the water and the wool and the wind. If you teach people the technique without teaching them the discipline, they will freeze, and their deaths will be blamed not on their own laziness, but on the ice." The warning settled over the basin like a second layer of cold. Michelle understood immediately. She had spent that terrible night outside repairing the cracked seam because she had no choice. If a homesteader 20 miles away tried the same technique and failed to repair a similar crack, their family would die. And the story that spread across the territory would not be about their failure to maintain the shell. It would be about the foolish woman who had convinced them to trust ice in winter. "Then I won't teach anyone else," Michelle said, and shook her head slowly. "It is too late for that. You already have. The men who came here with measuring ropes and questions, they are already back at their claims, soaking their own blankets. Some of them will do it well, some will not. And when the next big storm comes, the ones who did it poorly will be found frozen, and their neighbors will say the ice killed them." Coulter finally spoke. "Then we teach the discipline, not just the method." Anne looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them that Michelle could not read. Then the old maid's woman nodded once. "That is why I came," she said. "Not to stop the knowledge, to make sure it does not become a curse." What followed in the next 2 weeks was something none of them had anticipated. Anne Wahpeton began holding what she called a winter school in the sheltered basin around Michelle's cabin. She did not advertise it or invite anyone. She simply let it be known that she would be there, and the knowledge would be available for anyone willing to listen with the right respect. The settlers came, not in crowds. The winter trails were too dangerous for casual travel, but in a steady trickle of men and women who had heard the stories and wanted to learn before the next storm season arrived. Anne taught them more than technique. She taught them to read ice the way Coulter had taught Parker Vail to read snow in the Idaho mountains. She showed them how to distinguish between the clean, musical crack of surface tension releasing safely and the dull, ominous thud of a deep failure about to propagate. She explained why ice formed over moving water was never to be trusted, even if it looked thick and solid. She demonstrated how to mix cattail fluff into the water before freezing to create a fibrous matrix that resisted shattering. And she told them stories. Stories of winters on the Saskatchewan when the temperature fell so low that a man's breath would freeze in the air and fall to the ground as a fine snow of his own making. Stories of entire trapping parties that survived because one person remembered to add straw to the ice mix. Stories of frozen bodies found sitting upright, perfectly preserved, because the wind had stripped the heat from them so quickly that their muscles had locked before they could fall. The settlers listened in silence, and they did not laugh any more. Reuben Thorne attended 3 of the sessions. He stood at the back of the group with his arms crossed and his gray beard still frosted from the ride over, and he said nothing. But he did not leave either. He stayed and listened, and when Anne described the proper way to angle a blanket seam to account for a shifting wind, he pulled a stub of pencil from his coat and wrote it down on a scrap of paper. Michelle saw him do it, and she understood that Reuben Thorne, the man who had once told her she was gambling with death, had become a student. The school continued into the second week of February, and then something happened that none of them had seen coming. The temperature climbed, just for a day, just enough to soften the surface of the ice blankets by a fraction of a degree. That night it plunged again, and the rapid refreeze sent cracks spidering through the shell in a dozen places. Anne walked the perimeter of the cabin at dawn, her breath clouding in the gray light, and she cataloged every fissure with the detached precision of a physician examining a patient. "This is the second freeze," she said. "The test of whether your winter shell will carry you through to spring or collapse in the next storm." Michelle spent the next 3 days repairing every crack, following Anne's instructions. She mixed ash into the water. She packed the berm more tightly. She reinforced the corner where the October failure had nearly doomed her before the blizzard. And as she worked, she realized that the ice shell was no longer just her own project. It had become an experiment being watched by the entire district. If it failed now, the failure would not be private. It would be proof, in the eyes of every skeptic who was already waiting, that the technique was a fool's gamble. That night, alone in the cabin with the dog asleep by the stove, Michelle asked Coulter the question she had never thought to ask before. "Why did you stop to talk to me that day in August? You could have ridden past like everyone else." The old trapper was silent for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up again, but it was a mild wind, not a threat, just the plains breathing. "Because you reminded me of someone," he said finally. "A woman I knew on the Saskatchewan. She was young like you, a widow like you, and she froze to death in a cabin that should have saved her." He paused. "I didn't teach her the ice. I didn't think she would listen. And she died." He looked at Michelle, and his eyes were wet in the firelight. "I told myself I would not make that mistake again." The confession hung in the air. Michelle understood then that she had not been chosen for her strength or her cleverness. She had been chosen because a guilty old man had seen a ghost he needed to lay to rest. But she also understood that it did not diminish what she had built. The ice shell was hers now, not Coulter's, not Anne's. She had maintained it through the worst of the winter, and she would carry it through to the thaw. Spring was still weeks away, and the forecast was grim. Word had come from the fort that another major storm was gathering over the territories, a late-season blizzard that would test every shelter in the breaks. And this time, half a dozen families were relying on ice blankets they had built from Anne's instructions. If Michelle's cabin failed, theirs might fail too. If it held, the technique would spread across the entire territory. The storm was coming, and with it, the final judgment on whether the ice was a miracle or a death sentence. The second blizzard arrived on the 18th of February, and it was angrier than the first. It came without the silence that old-timers called the held breath. There was no warning stillness, no moment of gathering menace. 1 hour the sky was pale gray and indifferent. The next, the northern ridge vanished behind a black wall of cloud that rolled forward like floodwater, and then the wind hit. It did not build gradually. It announced itself with a single explosive gust that snapped the branch of a dead cottonwood near the creek and threw it 50 feet across the frozen grass. The cabin shuddered as if a great hand had slapped it. The dog dropped to its belly and whined. Michelle had already prepared. She had spent the previous 3 days following every instruction Anne had given her. The berm was packed tight with straw and frozen earth, sealing the gap beneath the walls. The north corner, where the October failure had nearly unraveled everything, was now reinforced with a double overlap, and a thin dusting of ash mixed into the final freeze. The chimney had been cleared of soot, and the woodpile moved entirely inside the sheltered zone. She had even tied a line from the porch beam to the goat shed, the way Coulter had described the mountain men doing it, so she could find her way if she had to go outside. The ice shell was as strong as human hands could make it. The question was whether that was strong enough. For the first 2 hours, the storm did nothing but rage. Snow drove against the walls in horizontal sheets so dense that she could not see the drift wall from the window. The ice sang its strange, groaning note, and she listened to every shift in pitch the way Anne had taught her. A clean, high ring was safe tension releasing evenly across the surface. A low, thudding crack was trouble. Twice in the first night she heard the low thud, and both times she pulled on her coat, tied the rope around her waist, and went out into the blinding white. The first repair was on the east wall, where a sudden shift in wind direction had caught a seam near the corner. The ice had splintered but not separated. She packed wet snow into the fracture and held it until it froze solid, the wind clawing at her back. The second repair was smaller, a surface crack near the door that she sealed with a smear of slush. By the time she stumbled back inside, her cheeks were numb and her eyelashes had frozen together, but the shell was intact. In the deepest hour of the night, the storm reached its peak. The wind became a continuous, shrieking pressure that no longer sounded like separate gusts, but like a single, unending explosion. The cabin walls vibrated, and the candle flame flickered wildly even though there was no draft. Michelle sat with her back against the warmest log. The dog pressed against her legs, and she thought of the other families. Esther Lyle, her nearest neighbor to the east, had copied the ice blankets after attending one of Anne's sessions. A young couple named Haskins, 2 claims south, had built their own shell from old army blankets they had traded for, and they had a baby not yet 6 months old. There were others, half a dozen homesteads now relying on a technique that had been laughed at as laundry on walls. If the storm found a weakness in their shells, it would not be merely a failure. It would be a judgment. The night passed with excruciating slowness. She fed the stove, checked the rope line, pressed her ear to the wall, and waited. Sometime near dawn, the wind began to slacken, not end but lose its killing edge. The hiss of snow against the ice became softer, more intermittent. When gray light finally seeped through the oiled window paper, she opened the door and looked out. The basin around the cabin had been transformed again. The drift wall that the first blizzard had built had been buried under a new, higher rampart of hard, packed snow that curved around the homestead like the outer wall of a great city. The ice shell was still there, visible only in patches where the new snow had not adhered, its surface milky and solid. The sheltered pocket of still air between the cabin and the drifts had held, just as it had before. The woodpile was accessible. The goat shed door was clear. The chimney smoked straight upward into a sky that was slowly turning from gray to pale blue. The ice had held. By midday, the storm was gone, and the Missouri breaks lay under a white silence that felt almost reverent. Michelle walked the perimeter, checking every seam, every patch of ice. The cracks she had repaired in the darkness were invisible now, filled and frozen and indistinguishable from the rest of the shell. The berm had not shifted. The north corner, the old enemy, showed no sign of weakness. The system had survived a second, angrier blizzard, and it had done so not because it was perfect, but because it had been maintained by someone who had learned to listen to the ice. The first visitor to arrive after the storm was not Reuben Thorne, but Esther Lyle. She rode over on a horse that was still lathered from the trail, and when she dismounted and saw Michelle's cabin standing clear in its sheltered basin, she did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, "Mine held too, the whole thing. We lost nothing." Her voice carried the disbelieving note of someone who had expected disaster and found instead a new kind of safety. Within the week, other reports trickled in. The Haskins couple and their baby had survived without damage, though their south wall had developed a crack that they had repaired in the dark the same way Michelle had. 2 other families reported similar success. One family, a widower and his son who had attempted the technique without attending Anne's school, had made a critical error in the overlap direction, and a section of their shell had peeled away during the worst of the wind. They lost part of their roof and most of their woodpile, but no lives. The failure was not the ice's. It was theirs, and they admitted it openly. The skeptics did not vanish overnight. There were still settlers who insisted that the ice was a fluke, that the winters in that part of the breaks had simply been milder than usual, that no one could truly trust frozen blankets to stand against a real Dakota blow. But the number of these voices was shrinking. The evidence was standing right there on Michelle's claim, and on Esther's, and on the Haskins, cabins that had weathered 2 major storms not by being stronger than the wind, but by teaching the wind where to go. Reuben Thorne returned on the first day of March. He rode in without the wagon, just his old horse and a pack mule. He stood at the edge of the basin for a long time, looking at the ice-covered cabin as if seeing it for the first time. Then he walked slowly across the frozen ground, passed through the gap in the drift wall, and stopped in the still air near the porch. Michelle came outside, the dog at her side. "I was wrong," Reuben said. The words came out rough, like stones being dragged across gravel. "I've been on this frontier for 32 years, and I thought I knew what winter could do. I thought I knew what a woman alone couldn't do. I was wrong on both counts." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the scrap on which he had written Anne's instructions about angling the seams against the shifting wind. He held it up. "I'm going to build one of these on my own place before next winter. If you'll teach me the rest, I'll listen." Michelle looked at the paper, then at the old veteran's face, and she nodded. "Anne's still here. She'll teach you herself." And so the winter school continued, not as a brief series of lessons, but as a permanent fixture of the breaks. Anne Wappeten stayed through the remaining weeks of cold, teaching anyone who came. She taught the berm. She taught the ash mix. She taught the sound of safe ice versus failing ice. She taught the discipline, the daily watching and maintaining that turned a frozen blanket from a curiosity into a survival tool. And she taught the caution, that the ice worked only for those who respected it enough to check it every single day. By the time the snow began to soften in late March, nearly a dozen families in the Missouri Breaks had adopted the technique. The story had spread beyond the local settlements, carried by freight wagons and army couriers to forts and trading posts throughout the territory. Some version of it would eventually reach the newspapers in the East, though by then it would be embellished and half wrong, as all frontier stories became. But the core truth remained. A widow, an old trapper, and a Métis woman from the Saskatchewan had proven that the coldest force on the plains could be turned into a shelter by anyone willing to learn the trick. Spring came slowly to the northern plains. The ice shells began to soften in the lengthening daylight, and one by one, the homesteaders peeled the frozen blankets from their walls and stored them for the following year. The drift walls melted into dark channels of runoff that carved paths through the prairie grass. The land, which had been scrubbed clean of color for 4 months, began to show pale hints of green. On a mild morning in early April, James Coulter rode into the claim. He was alone this time. No Anne, no mule train, just the old roan mare and his weathered saddlebags. Michelle saw him coming from a long way off, a small dark shape moving across the greening prairie, and she felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. He dismounted slowly, the way old men do, and he stood beside his horse for a moment without speaking. His hair was a mess of gray, and his face carried the deep lines of a man who had outlived most of his generation. But his eyes were bright and clear, and they were fixed on her with an expression she had not seen before. Not guilt, not regret, not the weight of an old mistake, something quieter and more dangerous. "I came back," he said. "I see that," she replied. He removed his hat and held it in both hands. "I've been thinking about what you built here, not just the ice, the whole thing, the way you listened, the way you didn't quit when everyone told you were wrong, the way you turned a crazy idea into something that saved people." He paused. The wind moved gently through the new grass. "I buried my wife in the winter of 1864 up on the Saskatchewan. I wasn't there when she died. I was off trapping and the storm came early, and by the time I got back she was already cold. For 30 years I told myself I'd never let myself care about anyone again. But I came here and I watched you and I realized that was a lie I'd been telling myself." Michelle did not speak. She simply waited. "I don't have much time left on this earth," Coulter said. "But I don't want to spend what's left of it alone, and I don't want to spend it away from you." He took a step closer. The dog, lying on the porch, lifted its head and regarded him with mild interest but no alarm. "I'm not asking you to answer now," he said. "I'm asking you to think about it, about whether you might want an old trapper who taught you how to freeze blankets." Michelle looked at the cabin behind her, where the ice shell was now just a memory of wet wool and frozen water. She thought of the winter, the fear, the repairs in the dark, the silence she had built in the middle of a killing storm. She thought of all the men who had told her she was foolish, and the one man who had told her a secret that had changed everything. Then she turned back to Coulter and gave him the smallest of smiles. "I'll think about it," she said. And spring continued its slow bloom across the Missouri Breaks, the prairie turning green around the cabin that had once been wrapped in frozen laundry and scorned. But the ice had not merely kept the cold at bay. It had trapped something else inside that sheltered basin of still air, something that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the quiet, stubborn hope that even the hardest winter could end in something unexpected. The central question that had hung over the claim since September, could a wall of ice actually keep a person alive, had been answered in the clearest way possible. It could. And in the years that followed, the story of the ice house on Michelle's claim would be told and retold, not as a tale of survival alone, but as a tale of what happened when a woman refused to listen to everyone who told her she was wrong, and when a winter storm was tricked into becoming a shelter, and when an old trapper, guilty memory became the seed of something that looked, against all odds, very much like love. The ice house on Michelle's claim is gone now. The wool blankets rotted decades ago. The log walls collapsed into the prairie soil. The drift walls long since melted and forgotten. But the idea that briefly wrapped that cabin still echoes through the Missouri breaks and far beyond. The technique did not vanish when she married James Coulter that June under a sky so wide and blue it hurt to look at. It spread. Not because anyone forced it on the settlers, but because winter is a patient teacher, and those who watched the ice shell survive 2 killing blizzards understood that they had witnessed something more than luck. Within 5 years, versions of the frozen blanket windbreak were being used by homesteaders as far north as the Milk River and as far south as the Powder River country. The Army experimented with ice-reinforced shelters at Fort Buford and Fort Assiniboine. Ann Wahpeton's instructions, transcribed into smudged charcoal notes and passed from hand to hand, became a quiet countertext to the official manuals that insisted wood and stone were the only reliable defenses. The ice was never perfect, but it was light, it was cheap, and it turned the one thing the plains had in abundance, cold, into a tool instead of a threat. And yet the real lesson lay deeper than the technique. The ice worked because Michelle listened to a trapper who had listened to a Métis woman who had watched her grandmother do the same thing on the Saskatchewan generations before her. That chain of listening, stretching across cultures and decades, is what kept people alive. The ice was not an invention. It was a memory, carried quietly by people the frontier preferred to ignore. Reuben Thorne built his own ice shell the following winter, and he never again told a woman she was gambling with death. Esther Lyle's children learned to check the seams before they learned to read. The Haskins baby, who survived that February blizzard wrapped in his mother's arms while the wind tried to tear the cabin apart, grew up to become a carpenter who built homes with double walls and dead air gaps, still echoing the principle his parents had learned in desperation. As for Michelle and Coulter, they did not grow old together in the way of storybooks. The frontier was too hard for that. Coulter died 5 years after their wedding, his lungs finally surrendering to the decades of frozen air he had breathed. Michelle outlived him by nearly 30 years, and when she passed, the cabin had become a way station where travelers would stop just to see where the ice house had stood. She taught the technique to anyone who asked, but she always ended her lessons the same way Anne had. The ice is never finished. It is always becoming something else. Your job is to know what it is becoming before it becomes it. Perhaps that is the truest thing about the story. Not that a widow outsmarted the wind, but that she acknowledged the wind would never be outsmarted, only accommodated, redirected, listened to. The storm did not care who lived or died. It was simply doing what storms do. Michelle's achievement was not defiance but attention. She paid enough attention to learn that the cold could be turned into a shield, and that sometimes survival depends less on strength than on the willingness to try something the sensible world considers madness. So the question is not really whether the frozen blankets worked. We know they did. The question is what other secrets are still lying in the memories of people we have never thought to ask. What other ancient, quiet knowledge is waiting, buried in the diaries of trappers or the oral histories of Métis grandmothers or the trial and error of a woman alone on 160 acres, and how many of those secrets will be lost before we think to listen. If a story like this reminds you that the past is still speaking, and that the answers to some of our hardest problems may already exist in the margins of history, then you belong with us. Subscribe and join the next story, because there are many more where this one came from.